Independent Long Island filmmaker Stevan Mena has recently reached a theatrical release deal for his horror film Bereavement, which won the Best Film and Best Director awards at last year's Long Island International Film Expo in Belmore. Bereavement will start showing on March 4th in National Amusements Theater in Farmingdale and in Holtsville.
This is my third feature. My other two features went to theaters, but not to this level. Yeah, it's very exciting. Bereavement is actually a prequel to a film I did called Malevolence, which came out in 2004 in theaters. It initially was a platform release, which came out in New York and Los Angeles and then expanded. But it wasn't the scope that this film is going to be getting. We're going to be starting with 10 cities and then expanding to 20, so it's a much bigger release, and there's certainly a lot more muscle behind it with regards to financing.
Mena grew up in East Meadow and at an early age fell in love with the magic of the silver screen. He says his early filmmaking experiences contributed a lot to the filmmaker he is today.
Yeah, when other kids were, playing sports and hanging out, I was making movies. I have just, acres of footage of stuff that I did back then. It's all terrible, but, this is how you learn. So I first got interested in film. My parents were divorced when I was 6 years old, very young age. And so I didn't see my father very often. And when we did get together, he would always take me to the movies. So I ended up going to see 2 or 3 movies a week, on the weekends. So I developed a great love of cinema very young. And I eventually requested a camera when I was 10 years old, and I did get one. It was one of these big, huge cameras that you carry on your shoulder with the VCR. So it was like, it's amazing when I see the little tiny things now and the quality, what I could have done with those back then. But I was just completely obsessed with it and tried to continually perfect what I was doing and make it professional looking. And so when I got out of high school, I went into film school, but that wasn't a success for me because I'm not really a big fan of structured learning, especially when it comes to filmmaking. And having done it for 10 years, I had a real great difficulty having people tell me what I was doing right and wrong. I have my own ideas on what works and what doesn't. So I left that and I ended up going out into the field myself, just kind of interning with other filmmakers and learning as I go on the set. And so that's basically how I got into it, is really just, by trial and error, learning by doing and just going out and getting my hands dirty. I think it definitely gives me a unique voice and a unique style, having done so much, on my own at such a young age and kind of forming my opinions on film back then. But yeah, it wasn't really, I've never really been involved, and even to this day, I work outside of Hollywood. I make my films on the East Coast. Malevolence was shot partially on Long Island, so I'm very kind of locked into like an East Coast mentality and an outside Hollywood mentality when it comes to making movies.
Mena has directed 3 successful feature-length films so far, the latest being Bereavement.
As far as feature films that have been actually released, it would be Malevolence. I made another film called Brutal Massacre, a comedy, which was kind of taking all the genre vets from the horror world and turning it on its head by putting them in comedic roles. And then, of course, I came back to continue the story of Malevolence, which is Bereavement, which is the prequel to Malevolence, and there's 3 parts to the story. So after Bereavement, there'll of course be the 3rd part of the story, which would end the trilogy, if we get that far. Well, Malevolence was actually based on a book that I had written back in the late 90s, and it was a 500-page manuscript that I thought, at the time, I was spending that decade trying to learn my craft at screenwriting, because I thought, well, I was told that the best way to break in is to actually write something yourself, so it gives you a little more power. And so I did that, and this one story just ballooned into a novel that I ended up breaking up into 3 stories. Malevolence being the middle part of the trilogy, and I did that first because it has a lot to do with the antagonist of this film being an adult, and I thought having the killer be a lot more revealed would not be as scary. So I thought keeping it in the dark would be much more effective for the suspense. So that's why I did Malevolence first, and now I'm going back to reveal the backstory of the killer and how he came to be. So that's why the films were shot out of order.
Mena says he's always enjoyed horror films. He says one of the things he's tried to do with his new movie Bereavement is to put more emphasis on storytelling back into the genre.
I've always had a great love of horror films, and fortunately for me, I found out that all of my favorite directors, James Cameron, John Carpenter, Steven Spielberg, they all started out with horror films. And the reason you do that is because on an independent level, you don't really have a lot of support. But horror has a built-in support from fanzines and websites, people who just devour this sort of independent scene stuff. In fact, the more independent you are, sometimes it adds to your street cred. So there's that, and then you can work with no-name actors on a very low budget, and that actually can sometimes enhance the quality of the film because nobody can guess who's going to live or die because there are known actors. And finally, when you go to foreign sales, the foreign sales market is a lot more receptive to horror films. They are an easier sell. They translate better than comedies or romance or drama. So, being that the cards are stacked against you to succeed in this type of business, having all those little things that can kind of give you an added advantage, you want to take advantage of those. So that's why I did horror first. Malevolence was definitely a straight shooter when it comes to the horror genre. There was no winking at the audience. There was no self-referential humor. It was a very postmodern look at horror films, but with a very 70s style and feel to it. And Bereavement kind of takes that one step further in that it enhances the dramatic elements of the horror genre, because you don't see that a lot today in horror. A lot of it is, kids having sex, doing drugs, and there's really no meaning to the violence that's portrayed on screen. Whereas with Bereavement, there's a very deep undercurrent of thought that went into the motivations of the killer, why he's doing what he's doing, the repercussions of the violence that he perpetrates on his victims is all examined very concisely in Bereavement, and it's very important. And you get to know the characters as well. All the protagonists are very, their stories and their backstories are expanded upon, so you can really feel something for them when they are put in danger, and when something bad happens to them eventually. You feel more than just a visceral response. You feel an emotional response. You actually can empathize with what's going on. And I think that creates a more memorable film in the audience's mind. It's something that you're not just looking away when it happens, but you're thinking about it after the movie is finished.
Mena says many people like what he's done with the horror genre, putting more emphasis on character development and storytelling.
I definitely think that audiences were ready to have the story elements return to horror. I think, certainly there's been enough horror that's just completely exploitative and doesn't have any rhyme or reason of why or what point they're trying to make. And I think Bereavement makes a very clear-cut point what it's trying to say. So I think that's why, and it doesn't pull any punches. There's a lot of verisimilitude that's employed in this film, and so sometimes things don't always turn out the way you hope in real life. And, in Hollywood movies, usually, there's a nice, clean, tied up, tidy ending. And with Bereavement, it's certainly not like that. If you're going to be real with your horror films, you've got to stick it all the way through. And Bereavement does that. And I think a lot of people were shocked at the ending of the movie and how things turn out. So that's certainly gotten us a lot of attention because it was a very risky venture making this type of script.
Mena says he also worked with very good stars for the film.
We got really lucky with our cast. We have Michael Biehn from The Terminator and Aliens in the Abyss. Fantastic actor, fantastic genre actor. We have Alexandra Daddario, who was an unknown when I cast her, and since then has surpassed everybody and become a major star. You can see her in Hall Pass this February 25th. You can see her in Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief. She plays the lead in that film, Annabeth. And of course you can see her in Bereavement. And then there's Valentina De Angelis, who's been in a ton of films, and she is also a fantastic actress from New York City as well. Spencer List, Peyton List, the two youngsters in the film, also from New York. There's also Brett Rickaby, who you might remember if you saw The Crazies last year. Had a really interesting turn in that film. Great performance. He plays the heavy in our movie. There's Nolan Funk, who, if you have kids, you know who he is. He's kind of the Zac Efron of Nickelodeon. So very diverse, very talented cast that makes up Bereavement, and very proud of all the work that they did. So it's going to be coming out in National Amusements, Farmingdale and Holtzville. And then I believe it's going to hopefully expand to additional theaters on Long Island. But those are the first two you can catch it at, so be there.
Or else. For more information, you could check out the website bereavementmovie.com. Chris Collora reporting.